Good afternoon, everyone. As you come in from the waiting room and get situated, I would like to welcome you to our webinar today, which is an introduction to resilience for trauma-informed professionals, specifically created and tailored for juvenile prosecutors. And I would like to officially welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Keith Cruz, and I am a co-director for the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice, the sponsor of our webinar for today. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the CTRJJ, we are a training and technical assistance center funded through or affiliated with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network with funding from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And the mission of the CTRJJ is to support a comprehensive framework for developing, adopting, implementing, and sustaining evidence-based, trauma-informed services for youth who are either in or at risk for juvenile justice involvement, while also supporting their families. While not reflected here on this page, but highly consistent with our webinar content for today, CTRJJ is also dedicated to leaning in and supporting the juvenile justice workforce in all of the roles as well. Put it succinctly, and how I will describe it is taking care of youth and families is really, really hard work. If we don't also attend to and thinking about how we are taking care of ourselves and our colleagues and our peers as well. And that leads us into our webinar content for today. But before I introduce our speaker, a couple of quick housekeeping reminders. I will be monitoring questions, and so please feel free to pose questions through the QA feature. And as time allows at the end of the presentation, we will respond to those questions. Today's webinar is being recorded, and all registrants will receive a follow-up email notification when this recording has been posted to the CTRJJ YouTube channel. There will also be a linkage point at the end of the presentation today where you can access instructions for downloading a certificate of attendance. This certificate is for personal use only, and unfortunately, we do not have this approved for CLE credits, but the extent to which a certificate of participation would be helpful for you, we're happy to provide a function for you to access one. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Patricia Carrig is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Utah, and is also a long-standing faculty member of the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice. Her research focuses on understanding the developmental processes that link childhood trauma exposure to adolescence and adolescent justice involvement, but also their recovery and resilience as well. Through the CTRJJ, Patricia has contributed to multiple efforts that work to develop and disseminate evidence-based trauma-informed practices in a way that protect staff from the effects of exposure to secondary traumatic stress. She is also the primary author of the RTIP model, which she is going to be introducing to you all today. So with that, I will turn it over to Patricia, and welcome everyone.
Thank you so much, Keith. I appreciate that introduction and the opportunity to be here to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. This slide gives a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to define terms, including secondary traumatic stress. And then we're going to talk about going beyond a self-care perspective to talk about ways in which we can foster our resilience. So in that light, I'll introduce you to some of the tools that are in the Resilience for Trauma-Informed Professionals toolkit. And along the way, we'll do a skill building exercise. But I want to start out today by telling you a story about why this is a topic that is so near and dear to my heart. As part of my work with the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice, a few years ago, I was doing a training using a curriculum called Think Trauma that was designed to increase the awareness of juvenile justice staff of the trauma that the youth they work with had experienced. And it was a curriculum that, in its first edition, it included some pretty graphic case examples. So I was doing a training with a group of probation officers down in Provo, Utah. And a gentleman who'd been sitting quietly throughout the training at the end raised his hand and said to me, "You've convinced me it's important that we know about the traumas the youth we work with have experienced, but I don't want to be the one to do this work." And I was taken aback and I asked him, "Tell me more about that." And he said, "Because if a youth told me that any of these terrible things had happened to them, I wouldn't know what to say." And I thought to myself, that makes perfect sense. You've been trained as a probation officer. Your training hasn't included how to respond in helpful ways to trauma disclosures. And moreover, your training hasn't included how to cope with the difficult thoughts and feelings that can arise when we learn about other people's traumas. So I thought to myself that something more was needed, and I set out on a journey of discovery to learn everything I could about how we're affected by exposure to others' traumas and what is helpful to us in the aftermath. And I encountered some wonderful resources that I'll describe to you today, but I also saw some gaps, and I'll talk about those as well. So, who in the juvenile justice system is exposed to other people's traumas? Well, essentially, we all are, from juvenile prosecutors and defenders, probation officers, judges, court staff, detention staff, forensic evaluators, mental health providers, and even researchers who study topics related to trauma and violence. There's some unique ways in which individuals in each of these professions are affected, but some common themes that have emerged in the listening sessions that I've been conducting include hearing trauma stories, hearing trauma disclosures, reading trauma-filled case histories, viewing graphic evidence, sometimes repeatedly, interacting with distressed youth and family members, and listening to our colleagues talk about their cases. Moreover, those who go into facilities or the homes of the youth with which they work talk about ways in which these exposures aren't just hearing about something that happened in the past, but can include immediate sensory inputs, sounds, sights, smells that tell us in a very visceral way that something bad has happened here. Well, why should we be concerned about exposure to others' traumas? In fact, they can have a real impact. As Tim Wires put it so succinctly, you don't have to be shot to go through a shooting. Exposure to others' traumas, in fact, can be a potential source of trauma for us. That may seem evident, but it's interesting to know that that hasn't always been recognized to be the case. The long-standing definition of trauma in the diagnostic manual definition is exposure to actual or threatened death, injury, or violence through directly experiencing it ourselves, witnessing it in person, or learning that the event has happened to a loved one. And this we can term primary trauma. But for the first time, when the definition was revised in the DSM-5, added to it was repeated or extreme exposure to the aversive details of somebody else's traumatic experience. And the definition goes on to give an example of officers who are repeatedly exposed to the details of child abuse. This is secondary trauma, and we can describe the effects of it as secondary traumatic stress. So if this is the case, addressing secondary traumatic stress, or STS, is a professional competency for those whose work involves traumatized individuals or trauma-related material. So we need to go beyond self-care to develop the skills for recognizing, preventing, and responding to STS so we can have those ready to use in our professional toolkits. But I want to say, even though I'm talking about this in the context of a diagnosis, having a reaction to others' traumas is not a sign of pathology. Far from it, it's only human. PTSD or STS come into play when those reactions cause us significant distress and interfere with our ability to function. Because after all, as Rachel Raymond puts it, expecting that we can be exposed to trauma-related information every day in our work lives without being affected is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to wade through water without getting wet. So before we go further, I want to talk about the different terms that get used to talk about this phenomenon, because I think each of them captures one facet of what is a multifaceted phenomenon. So the first term is burnout, and this refers to experiences of emotional exhaustion, alienation, and ineffectiveness due to work-related powerlessness and feelings of being unappreciated. Burnout can certainly happen in the context of working with trauma, but what's important to know about burnout is it's not specific to trauma. Anyone who feels powerless and unappreciated, even if they're just flipping burgers at Burger King, can experience burnout. Another term that is used is compassion fatigue. And this captures that feeling of being emotionally spent by caring for others without being able to replenish our own reserves. We've gone to the well once too often, and the well is dry. But this is a problematic term, and I want to explain why I'm saying that. There is a wonderful animated film that Brené Brown created to illustrate the difference between empathy and sympathy. And in this film, the little red fox has climbed down into the well of despair. Other animals come by and offer sympathy. Hey, looks rough. Hope you feel better soon. But this empathic bear climbs down into the well with the fox and shares the fox's feeling state. The fox feels no longer so alone and feels understood, which is positive. But if you look at this image, you'll see black clouds of despair over both of their heads. And I found myself wondering, what's going to happen to this bear? So if empathy refers to sharing another person's feeling state, compassion is something different. Compassion refers to seeing that somebody is in distress or in need of help and wanting to help them. So in compassion, we don't climb down into the well of despair. We throw a rope to help the other person up. And when we're doing our work in the context of a mutually supportive social ecology, we don't need to do that alone. We all have one another's backs. So I think a better term for this than compassion fatigue is actually empathy fatigue. Another term that is used is vicarious trauma. And this refers to the changes in our own thoughts and beliefs that can come about when we have engaged empathically with a traumatized person. And one of the reasons why I think this is such a valuable construct is that it's related to another one that's called moral injury. So moral injury is defined by Brett Litz and his colleagues as perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress our own deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. This was something that was first identified in military personnel who came back from service troubled by things that they had seen or things that they had been compelled to do. But since then, it's a construct that has been applied widely to a number of different populations, including in my lab to youth in the juvenile justice system. They have no difficulty identifying things they have encountered that are violations of their own moral code, whether those are things that they have done on their own initiative, done under duress, things they stood by and allowed to happen, things that they have witnessed, or the dimension we have found to be most impactful for young people is betrayal. When somebody they should have been able to turn to for protection and care did something that they feel is deeply wrong. So then we come to the last term, secondary traumatic stress, which is the one that I've been using. And in the formal definition of the term, secondary traumatic stress refers to the presence of any of the symptoms related to PTSD resulting from indirect exposure to others' traumas. And those could be intrusive thoughts and images coming into our minds, efforts to avoid reminders of the other person's trauma, negative thoughts and feelings, and feeling agitated and hyper-aroused. And because I think of STS as being on the extreme end of the continuum and including dimensions of the other constructs, it's the term that I'll be using today. Another reason why these different constructs are useful to think about is there also can be the opposite. Just as there can be so-called compassion fatigue from caring too much, we can also experience compassion satisfaction, the positive feelings that we derive from being good at our work, having positive relationships with our colleagues, and knowing that our work makes a meaningful difference. And just as there can be vicarious trauma, there can also be vicarious resilience, the uplift that we get from witnessing another's recovery from trauma. We know a bit from the research so far about the risk and protective factors for STS. A major risk is an isolative working environment, whereas connection with our coworkers is protective. The sheer volume of trauma exposure increases the risk, whereas helpful support and debriefing, which we'll talk about in a bit, can be offset those risks. Some research shows that those with a high level of empathy are at greater risk, whereas compassion satisfaction is protective. An important one is shame and negative judgments and self-condemnation about our own reactions when we experience STS, whereas openness and acknowledgement can be helpful. Coming into this work with our own history of adverse experiences and trauma can increase the risk, but that isn't an absolute. Research has shown that having achieved resolution and made meaning of those experiences erases that link. Then the last thing on this table is not something that we have research evidence for yet, but it's my hypothesis and my observation that going into this work, feeling unprepared and lacking training to encounter STS increases the risk that one will be affected. Whereas simple knowledge that we have the right tools in our toolkits is protective. So, what does secondary traumatic stress look like? Well, it depends on who you ask. But one wonderful resource I found was a book by Laura Lipsky entitled Trauma Stewardship. And she points out that if we are going to be working with people who have experienced trauma, we not only need to be good stewards or caretakers of them, we need to be good stewards or caretakers of ourselves and our own capacity to do this work. One of the things I love about her book is her use of humor, which helps us to look at some things that are very difficult. She got permission to use a number of cartoons from the New Yorker magazine, and so I asked for permission to show those as well. So let's see, what can STS look like? One potential sign of STS is feelings of helplessness or low self-efficacy. And although I think this is a very funny cartoon, I'm going to take exception to it a little bit later. Working so hard, but feeling like we're never doing enough. We're not getting anywhere. We're just howling at the moon. That feeling of hypervigilance, of being always on and barking at everything. Loss of pleasure in life. A big one is cynicism, when people find that they have lost that sense of purpose and meaning and optimism in their work. Alternatively, some people feel trapped by their own indispensability, that they're the only ones who can put out these forest fires. And although these cartoons are humorous, as I said, they are speaking to some real experiences. So in her book, Lipsky accompanies these cartoons with quotes from some actual people struggling with STS. So here's an animal rescue worker who says, every time I save a life, all I can think about is the lives I'm not saving, and that feels like a personal failure. Here, a community organizer talks about, all I do is go to work, come home, and go round and round the dial. That's my life. A domestic violence advocate talks about not even being able to take pleasure in looking at a friend's wedding photos without the intrusive thought arising, I wonder when the domestic violence is going to start. And here, an attorney talks about, it's not a feeling, it's true. If I don't do it, it doesn't get done, and somebody could die. I can never do enough. So the signs of STS can be physical, including physical exhaustion, headaches, backaches, not sleeping and oversleeping, even getting sick more often because our immune system is affected. They may be behavioral, including increased substance use or other kinds of addictive behaviors, including workaholism, anger and irritability, isolating ourselves socially, and what Francoise Mathieu refers to as the silencing response, shutting other people down in ways that let them know, I'm full up to here, and you can't ask anything more of me. The signs also may be psychological, emotional exhaustion, negative mood, cynicism, loss of pleasure in life, a changed worldview that can come about through moral injury, any of the symptoms associated with PTSD. And here we see some individual differences, that some people will report oversensitivity, that they can't bear to watch movies or read books that include images of the kinds of traumas that they're encountering at work, whereas others will report an undersensitivity and even be drawn to more and more of that kind of material. The signs also can be professional. that feeling of an overburdened sense of responsibility and being always on, or the opposite of avoiding work, resenting demands, and dreading the workday. Difficulty making decisions and self-doubt can enter in, as well as overall difficulty separating one's work and personal life. And although I'm talking about each of these as separate domains, of course, they can co-occur and interact with and compound one another. So I had mentioned these listening sessions that I've been conducting, and I have been inviting professionals who do fulfill various kinds of roles in the justice system to talk with me in a confidential format about how they encounter STS and how it affects them and the people around them. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit about what I have heard from juvenile prosecutors. First, I heard a lot about the frustration of wanting to achieve justice for people who have been traumatized, but finding the system thwarts them in ways that makes them feel so much of their work is for naught. Others talked about feeling overwhelmed, not being able to take their minds off their work, disturbing thoughts and images intruding on their sleep and on their home life. As one put it, even engaging in pleasant activities feels like too much, that we have too much on our plates. Also, there was cited a lot of people leaving the profession because of the effects of STS. And also, one insight is that there's a catch-22, that although STS isn't officially stigmatized in any way, there are subtle and unspoken ways in which people feel like it could be a danger for them to acknowledge that they are affected by STS, such as not being seen as the top candidate for promotion to a leadership position. So, does nobody know about this? Is this news? In fact, here is a sampling of what I found when I went to the literature. There have been a number of studies conducted on attorneys, including prosecutors specifically. So clearly, this is a phenomenon that has gathered some attention and that deserves more. In fact, recently, a court system in Australia was found liable for failing to protect court staff from the negative effects of exposure to what they were calling vicarious trauma. It was determined that there is a duty of care when an employee's exposure to trauma is inherent and inescapable in their work. So clearly, this is something that we need to address. So what happens when we go into the literature on how to counter the effects of STS? Almost universally, the first recommendation is to engage in self-care, a veritable sea of self-care. And there are some helpful measures that have developed that allow us to do a self-check of whether we're engaging in good self-care, including things like taking time off when it's granted, engaging in relaxing activities, getting exercise, eating healthy food. But what happens when stressed and busy people go home at the end of the day? Too often, the strategies that are most readily available to us are not the ones that are going to be most helpful in the long run. But even more than that, there's some evidence that self-care has limitations. One particular study that I was struck by followed a group of trauma professionals who participated in trainings on self-care. Their first finding was that these trainings did not increase the amount of time that people actually spent in self-care activities, which is perhaps not surprising. We don't always do the things we know we're supposed to do. But the other finding was really striking, that the amount of time spent in self-care was not associated with lower secondary traumatic stress symptoms. Well, why might this be the case? I think one possibility is that most suggested self-care activities take place at home at the end of the day. That's long after secondary trauma exposure, and it's divorced from the workplace. Instead, I think we need strategies we can use in the moment, in the here and now. We also need proactive strategies that can protect us in anticipation of exposures, and we need strategies that are integrated with our workplace environments. Another limitation of self-care is that it doesn't necessarily take into account individual differences that are related to our cultural backgrounds. These can affect the ways in which we understand trauma, our worldviews, and importantly, the strategies that we believe will be helpful to us in countering the effects of trauma and secondary trauma exposure. So, what would be an alternative to self-care? What I turn to is the concept of resilience, but what do we mean by that term? When psychologists first started studying resilience, they talked about it as though there were some people who were magically armor plated. They could walk through fire without being burned. They could experience horrors without being affected by them at all. But since then, we've learned that that isn't an accurate depiction of resilience, that in fact, people who are resilient are affected by their experiences. And that's probably just as well because having to wear a suit of armor around would be hot, heavy, and uncomfortable. I don't also think that resilience isn't captured well by that idea of having a psychological hazmat suit that insulates us from the toxins around us. In fact, having emotions related to our work is not only human, emotions are valuable to us. They tell us when something needs attending to. So instead, I think of resilience as successful adaptation in the face of challenges, while resilient people are affected by their experiences. It's also not an all or nothing phenomenon. We can be resilient in some ways, even if we're struggling in others. And it's not just a personality characteristic or matter of our own true grit. It's made up of strengths and protective factors in multiple domains. Those include the emotional domain, our capacity to be aware of our emotions, to cope with them with honesty and humility. The cognitive domain, our ability to make meaning of our experiences, to retain a sense of purpose and connection to our values. And then there's an interpersonal domain, our capacity to be generative, to have compassion for others as well as ourselves, and to stay connected to our social support and community. So, what enables us to be resilient in the face of exposure to secondary traumatic stress? I would say that just like exposure to primary trauma, secondary exposure dysregulates us physically, emotionally, cognitively, maybe even morally. And it causes us to experience as though it's happening in the present something that has happened in the past. So if that's true, the strategies that protect us will be those that reestablish our balance, ground us in the present, dispel unhelpful interpretations, and connect us to our values. So with these ideas in mind, I developed the RTIP curriculum, and there's an article cited here that you're welcome to look at that describes the conceptual underpinnings. But what I thought would be a more helpful introduction would be to describe for you how the curriculum addresses each of the stages in our encounter with secondary traumatic stress. And I'll talk about each of these in more detail, but just briefly, are there strategies that will help prevent unnecessary exposures to secondary traumatic stress? Prior to exposure, are there things that we can do to increase our readiness and resilience? And then what I found most missing from the trainings that I attended in my journey of discovery was what can we do in the moment while we're being exposed to STS to maintain our balance and recover it? And then after exposure, what are the things that are helpful for recovery? And each of the tools that I'm going to describe to you come from the workbook that accompanies the training in RTIP. So first, are there ways that we could actually prevent unnecessary exposures? One way to think about it is if, when we're gathering information about a youth's experience, if our purpose is to determine whether that youth is currently experiencing post-traumatic stress symptoms, maybe that's what we need to be asking about rather than the details of past exposures. So to that end, particularly for those who are working with youth in institutional settings, we have introduced a tool called the safety plan for triggers and coping strategies that invites the youth to talk about what are the things that might trigger you? Is it being left alone or feeling crowded? What are the signs that would tell people that you had been triggered? Do you get loud and curse, or do you get very, very quiet? And then third, what are the things that are helpful for you? Do you want somebody to come into your space and talk to you, or do you want somebody to give you 5 and let you recover on your own? So this is a way of learning not only about youth experiences of PTSD, but what's helpful for them without asking a single intrusive question about what happened to them in the past. Another way in which we can engage in prevention is by taking care of one another. Secondary traumatic stress can be contagious. So although it's very helpful for us to debrief and seek support after we've been exposed to a horrible story or a horrible image, we want to be thoughtful about the ways in which we might be passing it on. So the question is, can we benefit from getting support without sharing every graphic detail? And if we're on the receiving end of somebody else's debrief, can we gently steer them from sharing too much information? This is a technique called limited impact debriefing, or LID, as in keep a lid on it. And it has 4 steps: deciding what we need to share, giving the other person fair warning. I just heard something awful I need to talk about. And then waiting for consent for the other person to say, yes, this is a good time for me, and I can hear about that. And then sharing in a thoughtful way that focuses on the impact on you rather than the graphic details of the trauma. We also talk about what might keep us stuck in a trauma story, even if we've had a chance to debrief. And here we talk about the important role that our interpretations make, about what it means about us, about other people, or the world that such a thing has happened. Because those appraisals can affect how we feel, behave, and interact with others, and they're also open to change. I'm going to jump down to the third stage of our encounter in STS and talk about the ways in which we can cope in the moment. Here, the worksheets that I developed for the manual were very much influenced by that probation officer who told me I wouldn't know what to say. Well, indeed, if a youth discloses something horrific to you, what is helpful to say and what's not helpful to say? By the same token, we talk about worst case scenario. If someone has a full-blown post-traumatic reaction in your presence, how might you assist them with that? What would be helpful to do and what would be helpful to say? And in all of these strategies, we're keeping in mind individual differences, that what's helpful for one person falls flat for another. So we talk about lots of different strategies and the value of experimenting with them to find out what works for you. Our goal is not to have a single tool in our toolbox, but a Swiss Army knife that's highly adaptable. Then after trauma, secondary traumatic stress exposure, what helps us to rebalance and recover? One of the most important things we can do is to be aware of whether we have been affected by STS. And there's some helpful tools that have been developed. There is this online self-check that will give you an instant readout of your level of burnout, secondary traumatic stress, and on the positive side, compassion satisfaction. This is very helpful, but one limitation of it is that these are somebody else's ideas of the signs of burnout and STS, and they may not be your signs. So an alternative is to develop your own personal early warning system. So I want to pause and do a deeper dive into this. This is called a dosimeter, and it's named after what an X-ray tech wears, which is a little meter that gives a readout of the dose of X-rays they've been exposed to let them know if it's reaching dangerous levels. So the dosimeter asks you to think about what are you like when you're in your green zone, when you're calm and relaxed and clear thinking. Then what are you like when you enter your yellow zone, when you're beginning to be affected by what you see and hear in your work? And then what are you like when you're in your red zone and STS has completely gotten the better of you? What's really helpful is to distinguish between the signs that you show at work and the signs that you bring home. So many of the juvenile justice professionals I've talked with have described doing their work very competently and well, and the signs of the strain only showing when they go home at the end of the day. The other thing that's helpful is to consider who's the best source of information. We might assume we know ourselves best, but I'd encourage you to keep your mind open to the possibility that there may be those around you who see signs of which you're not aware. For example, one of my colleagues told me she could always tell when I was beginning to be affected by my work. And I said, "Oh, really? How?" And she said, "Because you lose your sense of humor." And I was completely unaware of that. I thought she just wasn't funny anymore. So this dosimeter becomes part of a larger personal protection toolkit that we develop that includes knowing our warning signs, engaging in a regular self-check, being attuned to the strategies that will help us in anticipation of exposure to STS, the strategies that we can implement in the moment and after exposure, as well as the longer term strategies that help us to be resilient and to engage our compassion satisfaction. We also keep in mind that study that showed people who do trainings in self-care don't engage in self-care. So we talk about all the things that can get in the way, including the thought that these are selfish or self-centered activities. When, as Saknava put it very powerfully, we have an obligation to our clients as well as ourselves, our colleagues, and our loved ones not to be damaged by the work we do. And as Robin Tenner put it very well, STS hurts you and hurts your family. And we also talk about how just going to trainings or reading about these strategies isn't sufficient. We have to actually use them. Otherwise, we're trying to fix our car's flat tire by reading the owner's manual. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that what we do individually is only one part of a larger multi-pronged effort to address STS. Yes, we can develop professional skills, and we need to make a personal investment to nurture our resilience, but it's essential that organizations also think about ways in which they can acknowledge STS, reduce the risks, and respond to staff who've been affected. So here we've jumped back to that second phase of the things that we want to have in place before we even encounter STS. So I think of organizational strategies as including preventing STS, monitoring staff well-being in an ongoing way, and responding to those who've been affected, including having non-pathologizing ways of connecting people to resources, even psychotherapy. Because as I said, my exception to this cartoon is that seeking therapy is not a sign of low self-efficacy. Another tool that was developed in response to attendees at a workshop who described their work involving all day, every day reviewing material that was graphic and horrific. So we developed a toolkit to assist people for doing that. But the first place we started was, what can organizations and supervisors do to prepare, protect, and respond to staff? And then what can individual staff members do? And for those interested, I'll be giving a workshop specifically on this tool at the American Psychological Association meeting in Denver in August. So there are a number of wonderful resources that are available through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network on how organizations can become more STS informed and how supervisors can implement these strategies. Here are some of my favorite sources on recovery and resilience from STS. There are also some excellent resources that are available from justice specific organizations. And with that, let me stop, and I look very much forward to hearing your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And I'm just going to, we can always circle back there, but we really welcome any posting of any questions using the chat function. and it's open and accessible for you just by clicking on that Q&A button on the bottom of your toolbar. But to kind of get us started here as well, Patricia, I was thinking particularly, I wonder if you have any reflections or any guidance, not an attorney, obviously a psychologist like yourself, but do a lot of work with lawyers in terms of case consultations, et cetera. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts around sort of the mindset or approach of a prosecutor and the role that they have in the justice system of proving facts, and presenting a case, to get it beyond that level of proof. And any concerns about that mindset, when that is oftentimes couched uh, in in harm that has resulted into another person, or learning about the harms of that has happened to even to the young person, that they are now responsible for essentially litigating an argument around their delinquent behavior. Any thoughts around how to manage that potential disconnect, when you're just then surrounded by a lot of information around severe adversities, extreme stressors?
Absolutely. I'm really interested in your thoughts about that too, Keith. I, what comes to mind for me is how grateful I was to the forensic investigators who attended my workshop and raised my awareness of what their jobs entail. The Not just, okay, glancing. I have done consulting work, and yes, I've had to glance at images or reports. No, this means detailed examination and description and processing of very upsetting images in a repeated way that I think is particularly challenging. I think one of the things that came through in talking with some other attorneys, they weren't prosecutors who said this, but I think it's relevant, is how important their senior peers were to them in setting a tone and setting an example. And the experience was very different of those who had senior peers who acknowledged this is rough stuff. And here are some of the ways in which I manage it, versus others who seemed to imply that if you're troubled by this, you're not suited for this job.
Yeah.
Which, wow, what a message that is to send.
Yeah, and I think Patricia, you just hit it. I was reflecting on the slide with body of armor, and even the language that you just used. You're not suited for this work if you don't have, if you don't have that protective armor, right? And I think that message is, most juvenile justice systems or prosecutors' offices that I've worked with. I mean, they're going to have the seasoned veterans that are the senior prosecutors or supervisors, and individuals may be coming out of law school and working in this field for the first time, and unless there's an acknowledgement within those teams or within that organization that you don't have to have that suit of armor, that this is challenging. You will have to grapple with sitting with that forensic video, listening to the victim of the physical abuse or sexual abuse over and over again. This is hard stuff.
Mhm.
Um, so I think that is so well put. A few other questions that come in here, Patricia.
Yeah.
The is the Some questions about sort of even just applications in other settings, right? For example, do you see that this could be done in school settings with teachers, or will some of the same skills or approaches that are embedded in RTIP, would it translate into other environments, hospital settings, emergency departments?
Absolutely. I have done trainings with teachers with entire school districts, and I think they've really resonated with it. I think we don't always appreciate how much teachers are on the receiving end of. Um, one of my recent trainings was with a group of healthcare professionals in Calgary, and they sought this out because they very much experienced this as a gap in their own training. That every day they are with people who are suffering, and they are seeing things that are not just secondary traumatic stress, but primary traumas for them, and have not received any kind of training in how to manage that. And I think, related to what we were talking about before with the suit of armor, one of the things that I strive for in RTIP is to help people think that the goal is not to have a lack of upsetting feelings, that that's not a realistic goal. And the research is really strong that all our efforts to escape from or suppress um, distressing feelings actually exacerbates them. And I think that accounts for that phenomenon of, hey, I'm perfectly professional throughout the day. I do a good job. My work is not affected, but my home life is a train wreck. I think that speaks to what we call experiential avoidance.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what a difference it makes to go into that situation thinking, okay, wall up, insulator on, hazmat suit on, versus, okay, this is going to be challenging, but I know I have the tools in my toolkit that I can pull out when I begin to experience those feelings. That's what I strive for.
That's great. And a real practical question, Patricia, from a social worker who is working in a family court setting, right? Um, is it's asking specifically about the slides. I can answer the question to that is that we do not make the actual PowerPoint slides available. But I think a question is, Patricia, do you have any other recommendations for even a one-page resource on like the coping strategies or some of those awareness of triggers?
The slides wouldn't be as good because I just, copied part of the, I am happy to share that. My email address is in the PowerPoint slides, and I would be happy to send a copy of that tool to anybody. It's free for use.
That's fantastic. And I think that's so accessible. Even sometimes those reminders on bulletin boards or in inboxes, et cetera, can be really, really helpful. Is noting that we're coming close to the end of our time today, I do want to just wrap up with a couple of housekeeping indications here. Is if you found this webinar useful, you can please see that there are a host of other webinars on our tip for other juvenile justice roles that we have upcoming. Please feel free to pass this along to your coworkers within your systems as well, who may be fitting the other roles, or accessing existing videos of prior webinars recorded on our website. Should you like to connect with the CTRJJ and to our website, to other CTRJJ resources, there's this QR code that you can link into here as well. I'll hold this for a moment in case you'd like to give that a quick snap. And finally, just want to thank you all for attending today's webinar. And similarly, we'll hold this up here for a while, but this is the code or the URL that you can access and a password protected website that will allow you to download a certificate for attendance for today as well. It is password protected with the password Prosecutors. Please feel free to take a picture of this. We've been informed that our website is affiliated with the Yukon health system, and it's currently down for maintenance or for other reasons. So hang on to that and hang on and take a picture of this as well. But I just want to thank Patricia for the information today, and thank you everyone for attending. And please feel free to follow us through the CTRJJ and or reach out to Patricia at her email address for any more direct questions and asks for some of those resources. Thank you so much, and hope everyone has a good day.